This strategy is perfect, and we are not going to back out from the war.
The Battle of the Somme stands as one of the most infamous disasters in British military history, a grim testament to hubris, miscalculation, and the deadly marriage of outdated tactics with industrialized killing power. The campaign began in July 1916, during the First World War. As a combined British and French offensive aimed at relieving pressure on Verdun and breaking the stalemate on the Western Front, at first glance, the plan seemed straightforward. A week-long artillery bombardment would obliterate German defenses, cut through barbed wire, and allow infantry to advance safely into enemy lines. The generals believed that once the bombardment had done its work, victory would be almost effortless. In practice, this overconfidence was the first deadly blunder. The British High Command assumed that the German defenses were fragile, underestimating both the quality of German fortifications and the ability of the defenders to endure punishment. Trenches were deep and reinforced with concrete dugouts. Barbed wire was far more resilient than predicted, often surviving entire days of shelling. The artillery was not precise, and the heavy guns failed to destroy machine gun nests and fortified bunkers. When the whistle finally blew on the morning of July 1, 1916, thousands of British soldiers climbed out of their trenches and advanced across no man's land, only to be met with a storm of German fire. Within the first hour, nearly 60,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. The sheer scale of the carnage shocked the world and marked the Somme as the deadliest opening day in British military history. The battle's planning mistakes were compounded by rigid adherence to outdated tactics. The British infantry advanced in dense lines, fully visible against the bleak, cratered landscape. Officers, trained in pre-industrial warfare methods, expected courage and discipline to be enough to overcome machine gun fire. They ignored lessons from Verdun and other recent battles, believing that morale and superior numbers could substitute for tactical innovation. Soldiers were given minimal protective cover, and the rolling barrages of artillery that followed the infantry were insufficiently coordinated. The result was predictable. The guns failed to suppress German defenses, leaving the attackers exposed to relentless fire. The battlefield became a scene of unprecedented slaughter, with soldiers cut down by machine guns, artillery, shrapnel, and snipers while trudging through mud, blood, and the wreckage of their own shattered weapons. Logistics also played a key role in magnifying the disaster. Supply lines were weak and often destroyed by the constant shelling. Food, water, and medical aid could not keep pace with the casualties. Men who survived initial attacks were left to die of wounds, exposure, or exhaustion. The sheer scale of loss overwhelmed medical facilities, and stretcher bearers risked their lives retrieving the injured from the shell-scarred fields. Horses used to transport supplies frequently drowned in mud-filled craters, adding to the chaos. The generals' focus on the abstract idea of breaking German lines blinded them to the very real human cost of each decision, turning the battlefield into a nightmarish quagmire where survival became the primary objective for the rank-and-file soldiers. One of the most infamous aspects of the Somme was its combination of attrition and limited territorial gain. Weather and terrain further amplified the suffering. The Somme region, flat and waterlogged, became a nightmare of mud and stagnant pools. After shelling destroyed drainage systems, soldiers slogged through waist-deep mud, carrying heavy packs and weapons, often collapsing from exhaustion before reaching enemy lines. Bodies, horses, and equipment sank into the mire, leaving horrific scenes of drowned men and horses that were indistinguishable from one another. The physical environment, combined with relentless artillery and machine gun fire, turned the battlefield into an industrialized killing ground where the landscape itself seemed to conspire against the soldiers. Despite the failures, British commanders pressed the offensive, prioritizing abstract objectives over human life. Field Marshal Douglas Haig, in particular, remained committed to the strategy of attrition, believing that continual pressure would eventually wear down German forces. The generals considered the enormous casualties acceptable in pursuit of a long-term advantage, but in reality, the Somme demonstrated the limits of attrition as a strategy. The German army, well entrenched and equipped with modern defensive technology, absorbed the punishment while inflicting disproportionate casualties on the attackers. The human cost of this miscalculation became a defining symbol of the horrors of World War I and the deadly consequences of rigid command structures. The psychological impact on the troops was immense. Soldiers who survived repeated assaults faced not only physical injury, but deep emotional trauma. The sight of comrades cut down by machine guns, the stench of decaying corpses in the mud, and the constant fear of artillery created lasting scars. Many men suffered shell shock, a condition now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Letters home, diaries, and post-war memoirs all describe a sense of hopelessness and futility that permeated the battlefield. The Somme's relentless slaughter and minimal gain left an enduring impression on the collective memory of Britain, shaping national consciousness and the understanding of modern industrial warfare. The battle also revealed critical deficiencies in military leadership and communication. Officers were frequently disconnected from the reality of the front lines, issuing orders from distant command posts. Radio technology was primitive, and runners often failed to deliver messages due to enemy fire. Coordination between infantry and artillery was inconsistent, resulting in poorly timed attacks. Miscommunication and overly centralized decision-making compounded the human cost, demonstrating the deadly consequences of rigid hierarchical structures in high-intensity conflict. In many instances, tactical decisions made at headquarters had catastrophic effects on soldiers' lives, with entire units wiped out by orders that failed to account for the realities of the battlefield. The Somme also influenced the evolution of military technology and doctrine. Tank prototypes were introduced during the campaign, highlighting the recognition of the need for armored vehicles to break through entrenched positions. Aircraft reconnaissance became more vital for artillery spotting and battlefield intelligence. Yet, these innovations arrived too late to mitigate the immense suffering during the early months of the battle. The Somme demonstrated both the terrifying destructive power of modern technology and the deadly inadequacy of outdated tactics. Leaving a bitter lesson for future military planners, the Battle of the Somme exemplifies the deadly intersection of hubris, rigid planning, and industrial-scale warfare. It was a catastrophe not simply because of the high casualties, but because it represented a failure to adapt, to learn, and to respect the realities of modern combat. Soldiers became statistics, terrain became a trap, and human life was subordinated to abstract strategies and the ego of the high command. The campaign remains one of the most powerful illustrations of the human cost of miscalculation in military history. A stark reminder that leadership and strategy can mean the difference between victory and wholesale disaster. The Somme's legacy is not only in numbers, but in its influence on memory and culture. It shaped British literature, art, and public consciousness, embedding the images of mud, blood, and sacrifice into the nation's psyche. War poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon captured the grim reality of the battlefield, ensuring that the lessons of the Somme would endure. The battle also informed military reforms and doctrinal shifts, compelling future leaders to reconsider the application of artillery, the importance of intelligence, and the human limits of attrition-based strategies. If you follow the story of the Somme from planning to execution, the campaign becomes a case study in the lethal combination of arrogance, outdated methods, and the brutal logic of industrial warfare. It forces a reconsideration of what leadership should mean in high-stakes situations, and highlights the human consequences of decisions made far from the front lines. The battle stands as a somber reminder that in war, strategy divorced from reality can have catastrophic, irreversible consequences. The failure of the British artillery barrage at the Somme revealed a catastrophic misjudgment of the enemy's defenses. British planners assumed that a week of relentless shelling would obliterate German trenches, crush barbed wire, and demoralize the defenders. In reality, the German positions were far more resilient. Deep dugouts made of reinforced concrete provided safe shelters where soldiers could ride out the bombardment, emerging largely unharmed once the shelling ceased. Barbed wire, which planners expected to be shredded, often remained tangled and intact, creating deadly obstacles for the advancing troops. As the British infantry climbed out of their trenches, heavily laden with rifles, ammunition, and packs, they followed the strict orders to advance at a measured pace. Running was forbidden. Commanders feared that any deviation would break the cohesion of the lines. The soldiers' slow, methodical movement made them easy targets. Once the German defenders emerged from their dugouts, they unleashed a storm of machine gun fire, mowed down advancing waves of men, and inflicted catastrophic casualties. The Germans, well protected and well positioned, turned the open expanse of no man's land into a lethal killing field. The combination of intact barbed wire and deep dugouts meant that the British had no realistic cover. Artillery, which should have neutralized these defenses, had failed to achieve its intended effect, and infantry tactics, based on outdated 19th century ideas, made the soldiers extremely vulnerable. The result was a horrifying scene: men falling in line after line, struggling to cross the wire, often trapped and exposed while under fire. Horses and supply wagons attempting to follow the infantry became stuck in the mud, further complicating movement and resupply. Communication breakdowns worsened the situation. Runners carrying orders were often cut down by enemy fire, and there was no effective way to coordinate adjustments between frontline troops and artillery units. Some officers attempted to call off attacks or redirect advances, but the lack of real-time communication and the rigid chain of command meant that soldiers continued moving into zones of maximum danger. Units became fragmented and disorganized, with pockets of men isolated in shell craters, fighting for survival rather than any strategic objective. The failure of the British artillery to neutralize German defenses also revealed a deeper problem. The generals underestimated the defensive power of modern weaponry and the ingenuity of entrenched forces. Machine guns, combined with the protection of concrete dugouts, turned relatively small numbers of defenders into a force capable of decimating waves of attackers. The slow, predictable advance of infantry became a textbook example of attritional warfare gone horribly wrong. Even when units managed to cross some obstacles, they were quickly pinned down by enemy fire. Unable to consolidate gains or advance further, the psychological toll on the soldiers was immense. Men could see their comrades fall in front of them, while they themselves were pinned by wire and gunfire. The fear and chaos were compounded by the noise of artillery, the screams of wounded soldiers, and the inability to take effective cover. Many soldiers suffered from shell shock, overwhelmed by the constant stress and imminent threat of death. The battlefield, far from being a controlled operation, had turned into a nightmarish trap, where survival often depended on luck rather than skill or discipline. This stage of the Battle of the Somme highlights the lethal consequences of poor reconnaissance, overconfidence, and failure to adapt. The British High Command believed that numbers and morale would overcome any obstacle, yet they failed to account for the defensive advantages provided by terrain, construction, and disciplined enemy troops. The stubborn commitment to outdated tactics, combined with faulty assumptions about artillery effectiveness, produced a slaughter that became emblematic of World War I. In essence, the British soldiers were not fighting an army so much as they were fighting the battlefield itself. Mud, wire, trenches, and machine guns formed a deadly combination that consumed men faster than any strategy could replace them. Attempts to adjust tactics mid-assault were minimal and largely ineffective due to rigid command structures. The failure of the artillery to destroy German defenses left the British infantry exposed in the open, a tragedy that underscored the dangers of underestimating a well-prepared enemy in modern industrial warfare. This catastrophic misjudgment set the tone for much of the Somme campaign. Over the coming months, repeated attacks met the same lethal combination of entrenched German defenses, intact barbed wire, and effective machine gun fire. Each failed assault reinforced the terrible lesson that attrition, no matter how massive the numbers, could not substitute for intelligent planning or adaptive tactics. The battlefield conditions, coupled with command errors, transformed the Somme into a grinding, prolonged slaughter where human life was treated as expendable in the pursuit of abstract strategic objectives. The story of the British infantry at the Somme in those opening days serves as a grim reminder of the consequences of arrogance, faulty assumptions, and the deadly efficiency of modern defensive technology. Soldiers faced not just the enemy, but an almost insurmountable combination of obstacles that their leadership had failed to neutralize. Waves of men fell under concentrated fire, trapped in a landscape that was designed by the enemy, enhanced by the failure of their own artillery, and made even more lethal by poor command decisions. The opening day of the Battle of the Somme remains etched in history as the bloodiest day ever endured by the British Army. On July 1, 1916, over 57,000 British soldiers were recorded as casualties, with nearly 20,000 men killed outright. These numbers are staggering, not just for their scale, but for the brevity of time in which they occurred. Mere hours transformed the front lines into a scene of catastrophic slaughter. The causes of this calamity were rooted deeply in the planning and assumptions of the British High Command. Generals relied on outdated tactics, believing that sheer numbers and morale could overcome entrenched German positions. Weeks of artillery bombardment were supposed to destroy the enemy's defenses and wire. Yet most of the barbed wire remained intact, and German soldiers sheltered safely in deep dugouts, emerging only when the infantry crossed no man's land. This miscalculation turned the advancing British troops into easy targets. As men went over the top in ordered waves, they faced a hail of machine gun fire, rifles, and artillery from well-fortified positions. The slow, deliberate pace required by command meant that soldiers had almost no chance to take cover or evade the concentrated fire. Shell craters, which might have offered some protection, often became traps filled with mud, water, or the bodies of fallen comrades. Communication failures further compounded the chaos, leaving units isolated, confused, and unable to adapt to the situation. The psychological impact on survivors was immediate and lasting. Men saw friends, brothers, and neighbors cut down in front of them. The air was filled with the screams of the wounded, the roar of artillery, and the acrid smell of cordite and blood. Many soldiers were immobilized by shock and fear, unable to advance or retreat, trapped by both enemy fire and the expectations of their officers. The sight of such mass casualties was not just a tactical failure, it was a trauma that scarred an entire generation of soldiers. This day exposed the deadly inefficiency of the British Army's frontal assault doctrine against modern defensive technology. Machine guns, long-range rifles, and artillery made linear attacks almost suicidal. The planners underestimated the lethality of these weapons, overestimated the effectiveness of their own artillery, and ignored the lessons of previous conflicts. The British infantry, trained and brave, became unwilling participants in a predictable massacre dictated by rigid command structures and poor intelligence. The tactical failures extended beyond infantry assaults. The lack of coordination between artillery and infantry meant that advancing troops often walked into board areas where bombardments had failed to neutralize the defenses. Reconnaissance was inadequate, leaving commanders with an incomplete understanding of enemy positions. Units that did manage to penetrate German lines often found themselves unsupported, surrounded, and quickly forced back by counterattacks. In many ways, the first day of the Somme symbolized the industrialization of death. Modern warfare had transformed human soldiers into expendable components within a massive grinding machine of attrition. Officers assumed that numerical superiority would eventually overwhelm the enemy. But this assumption ignored the reality of fortified positions, well-trained defenders, and the deadly effectiveness of contemporary weapons. Men were sacrificed in unimaginable numbers, not for immediate tactical gains, but for incremental advances measured in yards rather than miles. Despite these horrific losses, command structures largely persisted with their plans. The stubborn adherence to outdated strategies ensured that subsequent assaults suffered similar fates, with waves of soldiers meeting machine guns and artillery in predictable, deadly patterns. The opening day became a lesson in both the limits of human bravery and the deadly consequences of inflexible military thinking. The aftermath left a landscape transformed into a graveyard. Craters, mud, shattered trees, and destroyed trenches marked the terrain, a permanent reminder of the day's carnage. For the soldiers who survived, the experience was psychologically devastating. Many would carry the trauma for life, suffering from what was then called shell shock, now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The human cost was not just in lives lost, but in the irreparable impact on the survivors' minds and communities. July 1, 1916, stands as a horrifying testament to what can happen when outdated tactics collide with modern weaponry and poor planning. The British Army's catastrophic losses were a direct result of command errors, assumptions of invincibility, and the brutal realities of industrialized warfare. The sheer scale of casualties shocked the nation and the world, forcing military and political leaders to reconsider tactics, artillery coordination, and the human cost of frontal assaults. The first day of the Somme, with over 57,000 casualties in hours, remains a stark, unforgettable example of strategic failure in military history. It demonstrates the lethal consequences of underestimating an entrenched enemy, over-relying on artillery, and failing to adapt to technological advancements. The battle serves as a grim warning that courage alone cannot overcome flawed planning and the indiscriminate power of modern weapons. The Battle of the Somme did not end with a catastrophic first day. In fact, The horrors only deepened over the subsequent months. The British and French armies, under the stubborn direction of their commanders, pressed the offensive relentlessly despite the devastating losses already sustained. The initial massacre had demonstrated the deadly efficiency of the German defenses. Yet the generals continued to believe that persistence and sheer numbers could eventually break the lines. This unwavering adherence to flawed tactics ensured that the battlefield became a scene of protracted agony rather than a decisive engagement. The terrain itself compounded the suffering. The constant shelling and artillery barrages turned the already fragile farmland into a quagmire. Rain mixed with churned-up earth and decomposing bodies to create mud so thick that soldiers often struggled simply to lift their feet. Heavy equipment, supply wagons, and artillery pieces sank into the mire, halting advances and making movement across no man's land nearly impossible. The mud acted almost as a third opponent on the battlefield, claiming as many victims through exhaustion, exposure, and immobility as the enemy's firepower. Horses bogged down and drowned in shell craters, supplies rotted in the waterlogged trenches, and wounded men often succumbed to hypothermia or infection before reaching medical aid. Trench warfare during this period became the defining feature of the Somme. Lines hardly moved, and gains were measured in mere hundreds of yards after weeks of fighting. Soldiers rotated in and out of frontline positions, but relief brought little comfort. Constant bombardment, snipers, and the unpredictable nature of the mud created a relentless psychological strain. Men lived in squalid, waterlogged conditions, enduring vermin infestations and the stench of decay. Morale deteriorated steadily, and letters home frequently expressed despair, frustration, and a feeling of futility. The operational failures were as glaring as the environmental obstacles. Commanders failed to adapt to the reality of industrialized warfare. Artillery was often misdirected or ineffective. Communication lines were frequently cut by shellfire, and coordination between infantry and supporting units remained poor. When soldiers did manage to capture a section of German trench, they often could not consolidate or reinforce their position due to the terrain and enemy fire. Counterattacks routinely drove the Allied forces back, erasing hard-won gains. By the end of the 4-month campaign, the human cost had become staggering. The Somme became emblematic of the futility of attrition warfare on the Western Front. Commanders seemed unable to recognize that their rigid plans, based on pre-war assumptions and outdated tactics, were ill-suited for the realities of modern mechanized weaponry. Soldiers were treated as expendable, and operational success was measured in incremental gains rather than in strategic impact. The enormous casualty figures, the mud-choked trenches, and the grinding stagnation collectively symbolized the senselessness of the war, for those on the front lines and for civilians watching from home. The psychological impact of months of fighting in such conditions cannot be overstated. Soldiers faced relentless exposure to artillery, machine gun fire, and the omnipresent threat of death. While simultaneously enduring the dehumanizing conditions of trench life, the mud, rotting corpses, and waterlogged trenches created an environment that eroded not only physical strength, but also mental resilience. Shell shock became common, and the emotional trauma carried by survivors would shape post-war societies for decades. Even logistical supports struggled under the weight of environmental and operational challenges. Ammunition, food, water, and medical supplies were often delayed or lost, entirely due to impassable mud and destroyed infrastructure. Medics risked their lives navigating the chaotic battlefield to evacuate the wounded, and many men died waiting for treatment that never arrived. The combined effect of environmental and tactical failures meant that every aspect of the operation from command to supply to execution was plagued by inefficiency and human suffering. The persistence of commanders in the face of these failures demonstrates the rigidity of military thinking during World War I. Leaders were often more concerned with following pre-established plans, protecting personal and national prestige, or adhering to flawed doctrines than with adapting to the grim realities before them. This inflexibility turned the Somme into an endless cycle of attack and counterattack, where no side could achieve a decisive breakthrough. Strategically, the offensive achieved limited objectives. While some German positions were eventually captured, these gains did little to alter the broader course of the war. The front lines remained largely unchanged, and the attritional nature of the fighting served only to exhaust men, materials, and morale. The battle demonstrated that human courage alone could not overcome entrenched defensive technology, poor planning, and environmental hazards. In historical memory, the Somme has come to represent the brutal cost of mismanaged warfare and the tragic consequences of high command errors. The combination of human misjudgment, technological lethality, and environmental obstacles created a situation where success was nearly impossible without unspeakable human sacrifice. It stands as a cautionary tale about the limits of offensive operations in industrialized war and the devastating toll exacted when command refuses to adapt. By the end of the campaign, the battlefields of the Somme were a patchwork of destroyed villages, cratered fields, and waterlogged trenches. Soldiers who survived carried physical and psychological scars, while the landscape bore the imprint of industrialized slaughter. The experience left an indelible mark on military thinking, literature, and the collective consciousness of the nations involved, highlighting the staggering cost of stubbornly pursued, flawed strategies. The 4 months of fighting, the mud, and the staggering loss of life underscored a key lesson. Warfare on this scale demanded not only bravery and endurance, but also innovation, flexibility, and a realistic assessment of technological and environmental factors. Without these, even the most determined and disciplined armies could be ground down into a state of grinding futility. This extended period of stagnation at the Somme, with over 1 million casualties and minimal territorial gain, remains one of the most harrowing examples of attrition warfare in human history, illustrating the catastrophic human cost of strategic inflexibility in the face of modern industrialized warfare. The Somme's legacy stretches far beyond the immediate casualties and shattered terrain. It has become the defining example of strategic incompetence in modern warfare. The British High Command entered the offensive confident in the perceived superiority of their plans and equipment. Yet they underestimated every critical factor on the battlefield. German defenses were far more resilient and adaptable than intelligence had predicted. Barbed wire remained largely intact after weeks of artillery bombardment. Dugouts provided near-impervious shelter, and machine guns decimated advancing infantry. Each miscalculation compounded the human cost, producing a situation in which thousands of soldiers were needlessly exposed to lethal fire. This overconfidence in outdated doctrine and reliance on numerical superiority at the Somme illustrates the dangers of inflexible military thinking. Generals assumed that prolonged artillery barrages alone could break entrenched positions, reflecting a failure to understand the technological and tactical realities of industrialized warfare. Infantry assaults were ordered across open, cratered terrain, leaving men exposed to near-certain death. When initial attacks faltered, commanders persisted with repetition rather than reassessment. The same strategies that had failed catastrophically on the first day were applied over and over, demonstrating a shocking detachment from the consequences suffered by the troops. The battle also highlights the disconnect between high command and the frontline experience. Orders were issued from distant headquarters, often based on incomplete or outdated information. Officers in the field had little flexibility to adapt plans to changing conditions. Soldiers faced mud, shell craters, and relentless enemy fire. Yet their efforts were dictated by a rigid hierarchy that valued adherence to flawed strategy over human life. The result was a grinding, month-long stalemate in which men perished for mere yards of gained ground, turning the offensive into an exercise in attrition rather than decisive maneuver. Operational mismanagement was compounded by logistical challenges. Supplying frontline troops became a nightmare amid the waterlogged trenches, destroyed roads, and continuous shelling. Food, water, ammunition, and medical care were frequently delayed or destroyed. Wounded soldiers often died while awaiting evacuation, further amplifying the toll. The sheer scale of the battle, combined with environmental obstacles and tactical failures, created conditions in which survival depended as much on luck as on training or bravery. The human cost of the Somme was staggering and disproportionate to the territorial gains achieved. On the first day alone, the British Army suffered over 57,000 casualties, including nearly 20,000 dead, the highest single-day loss in its history. Over the course of 4 months, combined casualties exceeded 1 million, yet the Allies advanced barely 6 miles. These figures underscore the catastrophic consequences of flawed strategy when confronted with modern, industrialized defenses. Psychologically, the Somme left deep scars on both soldiers and society. Survivors returned home with physical injuries, shell shock, and trauma that would affect their lives for decades. Families received devastating news of deaths and injuries, creating a widespread societal grief that permeated post-war Britain. The battle also eroded confidence in military leadership, highlighting a profound disconnect between the decision-makers and the men they commanded. In military history, the Somme has become a cautionary tale about the limits of attrition warfare and the necessity of adapting tactics to technological realities. It illustrates how even well-equipped, disciplined armies can suffer catastrophic losses when commanders cling to outdated strategies and fail to respond to battlefield conditions. The combination of arrogance, rigid planning, and poor intelligence turned the offensive into an avoidable tragedy. Beyond the immediate consequences, the Somme shaped future military thinking. Lessons about coordination between artillery and infantry, the dangers of over-reliance on numerical advantage, and the need to consider terrain and weather in planning became integral to later military doctrine. However, these lessons were paid for in the blood of hundreds of thousands of soldiers who perished due to preventable mistakes. The Somme also remains a powerful symbol in cultural memory. Literature, memoirs, and commemorations continually evoke the scale of human suffering and the sheer futility of the battle. It represents the human cost of arrogance and incompetence at the highest levels, serving as a stark reminder that strategic brilliance cannot be assumed simply because plans are ambitious or forces are numerous. Ultimately, the Battle of the Somme exemplifies the tragic consequences of strategic miscalculation. The combination of poor planning, overconfidence, environmental obstacles, and an underestimation of the enemy's capabilities created a situation in which vast numbers of men were sacrificed for minimal gain. It stands as an enduring lesson in military history. Strategy, no matter how grand, must align with reality on the ground, or the cost in human life will be catastrophic. The Somme's legacy endures as a symbol of colossal failure, a testament to the devastating human toll of inflexible command, and a permanent warning about the price of strategic incompetence in modern warfare.